team, which recently produced its own 28th report on the threat posed by Daesh and Al-Qaeda. Mr. President, we all are witnessing the rapidly evolving situation in Afghanistan, which could have far-reaching implications for peace and security around the world. It is therefore welcome that Dr. Dawood Moradian will also brief the Security Council today. I would like to echo the Secretary General's appeal to the Security Council earlier this week to use all tools at its disposal to prevent Afghanistan from being used as a platform or safe haven for terrorism. Let us remember in this regard that several members of the Taliban remain designated terrorists according to the Security Council Resolution 1988 sanctions regime. I also note the concerns expressed by some Security Council members with regard to the release of prisoners affiliated to Al-Qaeda and Daesh. Despite the latest developments in Afghanistan, the Secretary General's 13th report on Daesh remains valid. Its emphasis on the interplay between armed conflict, state fragility, and terrorism, and Afghanistan is no exception. The report also notes that Daesh has expanded its presence in Afghanistan. We will need to ensure that Afghanistan is never again used as a launching pad for global terrorism. Globally, the threat posed by Daesh to international peace and security during the period under consideration has remained significant and steady over the past 6 months, raising serious international concerns. Daesh has continued to exploit the disruption, grievances, and development setbacks caused by the pandemic to regroup, recruit new followers, and intensify its activities both online and on the ground. Its core in Iraq and Syria has still access to significant hidden financial reserves, estimated between 25 and 50 million American dollars. Daesh has decentralized its governance further, and the additional autonomy, capacity, and confidence gained by its regional affiliates could provide the group new options, including to orchestrate international attacks and shape the future global impact of Daesh. COVID-19 related lockdowns in many areas were more comprehensive in early 2021 than in 2020, but it's conceivable that attacks have been planned for when restrictions ease. There is an increased near-term threat of attacks by lone actors or small groups inspired and possibly directed remotely by Daesh, including online. Only through cooperative measures between and within countries, including civil society and the private sector, can we counter the terrorist threat online. I welcome in this regard the first ever high-level debate held last month by this Council on cybersecurity, as well as initiatives taken at the regional level. Mr. President, Daesh remains focused on reconstituting its capabilities in Iraq and Syria, organized in small cells hiding in desert and rural areas that wage an insurgency against security forces while they move across the border between the two countries to avoid capture. However, it is the lack of a comprehensive solution to the situation of thousands of individuals with alleged links to Daesh who remain stranded in Iraq and Syria that could shape the future terrorist threat landscape over the medium to long term, not just locally, but globally. The conditions in detention facilities and displacement camps in northeast Syria have further deteriorated, especially in Al-Hol camp. Several instances of escapes terrorist radicalization, fundraising, arms smuggling, training and incitement continue to be reported, as well as killings and enforced disappearances. Thousands of children caught in this limbo through no fault of their own continue to have their rights abused and violated on a daily basis. I welcome the efforts of member states that have repatriated their citizens since my last briefing to this Council in February. But the pace is too slow, considering the scale of this humanitarian, human rights, and strategic security priority, which only grows more complex as time passes. And I think because of this development in Afghanistan, it could create even more dangerous environment in these camps with unpredictable consequences. I reiterate the Secretary General's call upon member states for the voluntary repatriation of all concerned individuals, with particular focus on children, in line with international law and with the consent of relevant governments. Next month, we will formally launch the global framework that my office coordinates with UNICEF to facilitate all of UN support to requesting member states on the protection, voluntary repatriation, prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration of individuals with suspected links to United Nations designated terrorist groups returning from Iraq and Syria. We have already begun employing this framework mechanism in support of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, and a scoping exercise has been undertaken to support Iraq. Mr. President, the report of the Secretary General describes that the most alarming development over the past 6 months has been the spread of Daesh in Africa, with spillover from Mali into Burkina Faso and Niger, incursions from Nigeria into Niger, Chad, and Cameroon, and from Mozambique into Tanzania. A global response is urgently needed to support the efforts of African countries and regional organizations to counter terrorism and address its interplay with conflict, organized crime, governance, and development gaps, as underscored by a wide range of member states during the second counter-terrorism week that we held from 28th to 30th of June this year in New York. Daesh's affiliate in the Greater Sahara has killed several hundred civilians since the beginning of the year in large-scale attacks in Mali, Burkina Faso, and the Niger. Its so-called West Africa province will likely gain from the weakening of Boko Haram. The situation in the wider region could be aggravated by the relocation of terrorists and other foreign fighters from Libya. The expansion of Daesh in Central Africa, and especially in northern Mozambique, could have far-reaching implications for peace and security in the region and need to be addressed through a coherent regional approach as a matter of priority, as the group's affiliates may seek to exploit intercommunal disputes and illicit trafficking activities. In Europe, the threat from Daesh has continued to be suppressed by pandemic-related restrictions. The threat of terrorism attacks by lone actors radicalized and incited online, especially vulnerable youth, remains the primary concern along with terrorist radicalization in prison. Mr. President, Assistant Secretary General Konings will brief you shortly on the support provided over the past months by the United Nations system to member states in addressing the threat posed by Daesh. My office has continued to work closely with all our partners to ensure business continuity during the pandemic and advance the implementation of our global programs and projects tailored to address the needs of member states. These efforts are supported through our presence in the field, as requested by member states, including our Program Office for Counterterrorism and Training in Rabat, and the Program Office on Parliamentary Engagement in Doha, which we launched in June in partnership with Morocco and Qatar, respectively. Our global program on detecting, preventing, and countering the financing of terrorism in response to the Security Council Resolution 2462 of 2019 leads on a joint initiative with the Global Counterterrorism Forum to identify and disseminate good practices to effectively counter terrorism financing while safeguarding civic space. The United Nations Countering Terrorist Travel Program, led by my office, to help member states establish advanced passenger information and passenger name record system in line with Security Council Resolution 2178 of 2014, 2396 of 2017, and 2482 2019, now counts 43 beneficiaries. The program held 3 virtual assessments for Djibouti, Mongolia, and South Africa, and interactive online trainings for Sierra Leone, the Gambia, and member states of the Southern African Development Community. We also completed a series of virtual study visits to Belgium, Colombia, Norway, the Russian Federation, and Spain for the beneficiaries of our global program on national level interagency coordination mechanisms, or fusion cells, and launched in January a new global program on countering terrorist threat against vulnerable targets. Mr. President, 2021 is a year of milestones in the international fight against terrorism. The time couldn't be better for member states to recommit themselves to multilateral action against terrorism under the auspices of the United Nations. 20 years ago, in the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks by Al-Qaeda, the Security Council provided momentous leadership and guidance with the adoption of its landmark resolution 1373 and the establishment of its Counterterrorism Committee. Today, we face transnational terrorist threats like Daesh and Al-Qaeda that are enduring and able to adapt to new technologies, but also expanding to include individuals and groups that commit terrorist attacks connected to xenophobia, racism, and other forms of intolerance. Unity and leadership from the Security Council remains as critical today as in 2001 to confront terrorism in a sustained, collective, effective, and principled manner that upholds the rule of law, human rights, gender equality, and safeguards humanitarian action. This year also marks the 15th anniversary of the United Nations Global Counterterrorist Strategy and the 10th anniversary of the United Nations Counterterrorist Center in my office. I was highly encouraged, therefore, by the success of our second Counterterrorism Week in June, during which member states actively engaged in the second high-level conference of heads of counterterrorism agencies convened by the Secretary General, and the consensus adoption of the General Assembly of a comprehensive and forward-looking resolution for the review of the global counterterrorist strategy. This bodes well for our collective efforts and bad for Daesh and other terrorists. The United Nations system, through the Global Counterterrorist Coordination Compact, stands ready to support you and all member states. I look forward to the guidance from this Council as we are transition into a new decade for counterterrorism. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Voronkov for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Michelle Koninsk.
for the opportunity to brief the Council on the 13th report of the Secretary General on the threats posed by Daesh and the continued efforts of the United Nations and member states to counter the threat. I'd also like to thank Under Secretary General Voronkov for his overview of the report and to commend both the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism and the Analytical Support and Sanction Monitoring Team led by Mr. Edmund Fitton-Brown for their invaluable contributions to the report. Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, as USG Voronkov rightfully said, we all are witnessing the rapidly evolving situation in Afghanistan. And I also wish to echo the Secretary General's appeal to the Security Council to take all possible steps to ensure that the situation in Afghanistan does not result in Afghanistan being used as a safe haven for terrorism. Despite welcome progress in the rollout of vaccines, the COVID-19 pandemic has continued to have negative impacts across most policy areas over the past 6 months. However, as we outlined in CTAT's most recent analytical paper published in June 2021, COVID-19's impact on terrorism and counterterrorism has been more mixed. In many non-conflict zones, pandemic-related restrictions have continued to help suppress terrorist activity. In conflict zones, however, where the impact of pandemic-related restrictions is limited, the increasing interplay between terrorism, fragility, and conflict has caused the terrorist threat to grow. Indeed, Daesh and its affiliates continue to pose a significant threat in West, East and Central Africa and Afghanistan, while simultaneously prioritizing their efforts to regroup and research in Iraq and the Syrian Arab Republic. CTAT's analytical paper also emphasized the pandemic's worrying impacts on humanitarian programming across the world, including in Iraq and the Syrian Arab Republic. We continue to be concerned by the dire situation faced by these individuals, mainly women and children with presumed links to Daesh. Through the virtual component of the Counterterrorism Committee's recent hybrid assessment visits to both Iraq and to member states from which FTFs had traveled to the conflict zones, CTAT has continued to monitor compliance with the relevant Security Council resolutions. Although United Nations entities continue to promote the safe, voluntary, and human rights compliant return of foreign nationals from Iraq and the Syrian Arab Republic, many remain stranded in crowded camps with limited access to essential services, due process, and fair trial. These concerns have only been exacerbated by the pandemic. Secretary General's report highlights violence in the camps and forced disappearances and other human rights abuses as serious concerns, in addition to the forced returns, the prevention of return, and the discriminatory treatment of families with a perceived link to Daesh. Further efforts are needed to create conditions under which social cohesion can be promoted and further Daesh violence prevented while ensuring respect for human rights and the rule of law. Mr. President, Excellencies, these challenges remind us yet again of the critical need for us to strengthen national, regional, and international counterterrorism efforts. In this regard, I welcome the discussions held during recent hybrid assessment visits conducted for the Counterterrorism Committee of the Security Council, the 2021 Counterterrorism Week, and its side events and new threats and challenges, and how best to marshal our collective efforts to address them. I also welcome the Counterterrorism Committee's approval of the revised overview of implementation assessment and the electronic detailed implementation survey in March 2021, which were developed by CEDAT in accordance with Resolution 2395. These new analytical tools will help CEDAT to improve on monitoring of the implementation of relevant Security Council resolutions by member states in a timely manner and will enhance CEDAT quantitative and qualitative analytical capacities and capabilities. They are also expected to support member states' efforts to adopt comprehensive and integrated counterterrorism approaches. It's also important to reflect on other examples of progress made over the past 6 months. Criminal justice responses, international judicial cooperation, and the development of comprehensive and tailored prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration strategies have continued to be significant priorities for CEDAT and many of our UN partners. CEDAT, in cooperation with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime and UNOCT, has supported efforts to increase cooperation in investigations and prosecutions at the national and local levels in Nigeria and the Lake Chad Basin. In March, CEDAT, UNOCT, and UNODC jointly held a regional workshop that promoted gender-responsive approaches in PRR strategies in the Lake Chad Basin. There has also been welcome progress in the development of good practices in international and regional counterterrorism cooperation, including in relation to judicial cooperation, mutual legal assistance, and extradition in terrorism cases. CEDAT and our partners further supported the Maldives and the Philippines on the use of the internet and social media in counterterrorism investigations. And CEDAT, together with UNODC, continued to tailor their South Asia regional toolkit for judges to the national context of Maldives and Pakistan. Mr. President, Excellencies, CEDAT analysis suggests that terrorists and terrorist groups, including Daesh, are exploring alternative methods of moving funds due to the impact of pandemic-related measures on money transfer networks and the use of social media crowdfunding campaigns for Daesh fighters and their relatives in camps in the Syrian Arab Republic also remain an ongoing challenge. To address these challenges, CEDAT, in cooperation with other UN entities, continues to work together with the Financial Action Task Force and the FATF STAR regional bodies and the Global Counterterrorism Forum. And due to the terrorism financing risk associated with the illicit trade in natural resources, CEDAT, together with the UN Counterterrorism Center, supported the Eastern and Southern African Anti-Money Laundering Group in implementing its regional operational plan for combating the financing of terrorism. CEDAT continued to play a key role in facilitating technical assistance, including by leading virtual consultation missions, which fall under the All of UN approach, UNOCT, UNCCT, global programs, and by supporting activities on topics including terrorism arms, crime nexus, protection of vulnerable targets, fusion cells, and countering terrorist travel. CEDAT and UNODC also held a workshop to promote relevant Security Council resolutions and offer expertise to Nigerian law enforcement officers in the application of international best practices regarding intelligence collection and Mr. President, Excellencies, Daesh and its affiliates remain a significant concern and threat to international peace and security. The upcoming joint open briefing on ISIL in Africa on the 18th of October upcoming will allow us to further explore the recent evolution of these affiliates on the African continent. A comprehensive, coordinated, one UN approach remains crucial to develop and implement effective counterterrorism measures while also addressing conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism and violent extremism. And of course, we must do so while ensuring that our multilateral counterterrorism efforts do no harm. In closing, I would like to express my hope that the forthcoming CTC special meeting on the 20 years of anniversary, the adoption of resolution, landmark resolution as set by Mr. Voronkov 1373 on the 13th of September 2021, will serve as a forum for further enhancing and strengthening our multilateral counterterrorism efforts. I do thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. Codex for her briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Dawood Moradian, who I believe was in Kabul till a few days ago. Mr. Moradian, the floor is yours.
Mr. President, Honorable Minister Jaishankar, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me to have the opportunity to share with this August forum my perspective on the threat of Daesh to international peace and security. In light of the unfolding catastrophe and humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, I will also bring in the Afghan tragedy and factors in the context of today's briefing. In less than 3 weeks, the world would witness and commemorate the tragic and painful 20th anniversary of 9/11 terrorist attack, which gave birth to our collective struggle against terrorism. The fact that the UN Security Council held a regular session on Daesh in August 2021 is a testimony that the world has collectively failed to deal with the threat of terrorism after 20 years and despite allocating abundant resources in blood and treasure. And I would like to offer my reflection and analysis on some reason for our collective failures. I would begin from my own field, the academic world. There is hardly any reasonable consensus and intellectual agreements on the very definition and understanding of terrorism. The diversity of names and labels to describe militant Islamist movement indicate this conceptual confusion. Names such as jihadists, Salafi, fundamentalists, Islamic terrorists, extremists, violent extremists, Islamofascists, insurgent, barbarian, terrorists, foreign terrorists, international terrorism, and some other names and labels are used. The failure of the Islamic world to own its share of responsibility is the other important reason for our collective failure. While the bulk of terrorist perpetrator and victim have been Muslim, sadly the Islamic world has remained passive observer in our narrative about an existential threat to Muslims' well-being and security. The intellectual and political stagnation of religious, cultural, and educational institutions have immensely contributed to the rise of extremism and the failures of defensive measures against this threat in the Islamic world. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, let me bring in the role of the most privileged member of the international system, as you call member states, in our collective failures. The overwhelming approach to terrorism has been to treat terrorism as a non-state phenomenon and independent from a state-centric international system. In reality, however, terrorism is a product of the state system, and one or other states tend to be behind or above a given terrorist group. In some cases, there are a group of like-minded states that support a group, as was the case with the Mujahideen during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Daesh would not have survived and flourished had it not been for the support that it received from some member states. Sadly, the UN system protects its guilty members, we engage in proxy war against a regional and global adversary by utilizing terrorism as a state policy. The disconnection between UN analytical reports and UN political statement and action show the UN's incapability to confront a state sponsorship of terrorism. Our global struggle against terrorism can be also compared and contrasted with our other global struggle against COVID-19 pandemic. In our recent struggle, we have witnessed the phenomenon of vaccine nationalism, which the rich nation choose self-interest over collective interests. Despite the rhetoric of fighting all forms of terrorism, sadly, many governments have chosen to focus on their own terrorists rather than the integrated nature of global terrorism. The case of Afghanistan is a prime example of the contradictory approach to deal with terrorism. Many have been recommending political means to deal with the Taliban, while advocating military solution to other like-minded groups such as Al-Qaeda, Daesh, Pakistani Taliban, and the EAM. Ladies and gentlemen, if there is a utility and wisdom in a political approach to the Taliban, why should not it be extended to other groups or the other way around? All these groups share fundamental characteristics with one another, despite differences in the scope of their activity. Again, using the COVID-19 analogy, they are variants of the same original phenomenon, which have been mutated to different degree of lethality and version, as with the alpha, beta, and delta variants. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, terrorism, 9/11, and Afghanistan have become defining name in global conversation about terrorism. The takeover of Kabul by the Taliban on the eve of the 20th anniversary of 9/11 would be remembered as a historic benchmark and a turning point. It is natural to be fascinated by the symbolic coincidence of the two anniversary or intellectual discussion about the definition of terrorism, or to engage in political debate about blame game. But what we must focus now is the humanitarian dimension and the unfolding catastrophe. As Honorable Minister stated, I was at Kabul airport when desperate passengers held departing U.S. airplanes, and also my own airplane that was due to leave Kabul airport. It was sheer human desperation, helplessness, and fear. One of the passengers that fell to the ground from a flying U.S. airplane was reportedly a member of Afghanistan national football team. These passengers were not alone in their desperation and fear. They represent millions of Afghans from diverse backgrounds, from women's rights activists to destitute farmers. The world must intervene to avert and mitigate an apocalyptic humanitarian tragedy. And to this end, the UN must overcome its usual approach by declaring the situation as urgent humanitarian crisis under the Chapter 7 provision of the United Nations Charter. This should include serious and urgent deliberation to declare Kabul as safe zone, protected by a UN peacekeeping mission. This would allow the opposing faction to come to an inclusive political settlement while working to mitigate the unfolding catastrophe. I use the word of catastrophe very intentionally because I was in a very catastrophic situation in Kabul just 48 hours ago. So it's not an exaggeration when I make reference to when I use the word of catastrophe, which also was used by UN Secretary General in recent reports to the Council. The crisis of Afghanistan during the last 4 decades has shown that a military solution is just a brief pause to the next phase of the war. The Taliban and their regional partners, particularly the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, should reflect on their principal role in either mitigating or accelerating a catastrophic situation in Afghanistan, an outcome that will determine our decades-old against terrorism. And I thank you all for your listening. Thank you, Mr. President and ladies and gentlemen.
I thank Mr. Moradian for his briefing. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the Minister of External Affairs of India. And let me begin by thanking Mr. Vladimir Voronkov, USG UNOCT, and Ms. Michelle Koninsk, Executive Director, CTED, for their briefings on the 13th report of the Secretary General on the threat posed by ISIL-Daesh to international peace and security. I, of course, repeat my thanks to Mr. Moradian, Director General of the Afghan Institute for Strategic Studies, for joining us remotely today. Excellencies, the world will be commemorating the 4th International Day of Remembrance and Tribute to Victims of Terrorism day after tomorrow. Next month, it will be 20 years since the horrific 9/11 tragedy in New York. We in India have, of course, had more than our fair share of both challenges and casualties. The 2008 Mumbai terror attack is imprinted in our memories. The 2016 Pathankot airbase attack and the 2019 suicide bombing of our policemen at Pulwama were even more recent. Let me therefore express my solidarity with the victims and their families all over the world who have suffered and continue to suffer from the scourge of terrorism. We must never compromise with this evil. The international community holds a collective view that terrorism in all its forms and manifestations must be condemned. There cannot be any exception or any justification for any act of terrorism, regardless of motivations behind such acts. We also recognize that the menace of terrorism cannot be and should not be associated with any religion, nationality, civilization, or any ethnic group. However, in spite of the progress we have made to tighten the legal, security, financing, and other frameworks to combat terrorism, terrorists are constantly finding newer ways of motivating, resourcing, and executing acts of terror. Unfortunately, there are also some countries who seek to undermine or subvert our collective resolve to fight terrorism. That cannot be allowed to pass. The latest report of the Secretary General has provided another stark reminder to all of us that ISIL, Daesh, continues to pose a critical threat to international peace and security. ISIL, Daesh remains active in Syria and Iraq, and its affiliates are growing in strength, particularly, as we heard from the briefers, in Africa. The financial resource mobilization of ISIL-Daesh has become more robust. The flow of funds has continued, and rewards for killing, I believe, are now being paid even in Bitcoin. The radicalization of vulnerable youth by systematic online propaganda campaign remains a serious concern. In our own immediate neighborhood, ISIL Khorasan has become more energetic and is constantly seeking to expand its footprint. This should be taken seriously. Events unfolding in Afghanistan have naturally enhanced global concerns about their implications for both regional and international security. The heightened activities of the proscribed Haqqani network justifies this growing anxiety. Whether it is in Afghanistan or against India, groups like Lashkar-e-Toiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed continue to operate with both impunity and encouragement. It is therefore vital that this Council does not take a selective, tactical, or even a complacent view of the problems we face. We must never countenance sanctuaries for terrorists or overlook the raising of their resources. And when we see state hospitality being extended to those with innocents' bloods on their hand, we should never lack the courage to call out this doublespeak. We heard from the briefers of the aggravating impact of the pandemic. What is true of COVID is even more true of terrorism. None of us are safe until all of us are safe. Insofar as ISIL is concerned, its modus operandi has changed, with the core focusing on regaining ground in Syria and Iraq, and affiliates functioning independently. This evolving phenomenon is extremely dangerous and poses a new set of challenges to our collective efforts in our fight against ISIL and terrorism. In January 2021, when I had an opportunity to address this council virtually at that time, I had proposed an 8-point action plan for consideration. Let me reiterate some of its cardinal principles. 1, to summon the political will. Don't justify terrorism, don't glorify terrorists. 2, no double standards. Terrorists are terrorists. Distinctions can only be made at our own peril. 3, don't place blocks and holds on listing requests without any reason. 4, discourage exclusivist thinking and be on guard against new terminologies and false priorities. 5, enlist and delist objectively, not on political or religious considerations. 6, recognize the linkage to organized crime. 7, support and strengthen the FATF. And 8, provide greater funding to the UN Office on Counterterrorism. I call on this Council to collectively build on these principles. It is also important therefore to end the stalemate preventing the adoption of a comprehensive Convention on International Terrorism, which India has championed for so long. India has been at the forefront of global counterterrorism efforts, has taken part in all major global initiatives against international terrorism, and is party to all UN sectoral conventions relating to terrorism. We are pleased to play our role in strengthening the global counterterrorism strategy adopted last month. We reiterate our full support for counterterrorism cooperation under the auspices of UN. I thank you. I resume my functions as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Linda Thomas-Greenfield, Permanent Representative of the United Nations and a member of President Biden's cabinet.
Thank you, Mr. President. Today's meeting is an important opportunity to discuss the ISIS threat and actions we're all taking to prevent and counter terrorism. And our thanks to Undersecretary General Voronkov, Assistant Secretary General Konix, and Mr. Mouradian for your informative briefings today. I would also like to thank the Analytical Support and Sanctions Monitoring Team, the Counterterrorism Committee Executive Directorate, the UN Office of Counterterrorism, and other United Nations entities that contributed to this report. Today, I'd like to discuss the current state of the threat posed by ISIS and everything we can do to counter that threat, especially by undercutting its finances. To start, we're deeply worried by the Secretary General's assessment that ISIS continues to expand throughout Africa, especially in various parts of West Africa and the Sahel, in addition to Central and East Africa. To neutralize that expansion, the United States is providing critical counterterrorism assistance to disrupt, degrade, and respond to terrorist activity perpetrated by ISIS. Our tactical training, mentorship, and equipment strengthens the capacity of the law enforcement, judicial sector, and communities in our partner nations to respond to this growing threat. In June, ISIS Khorasan attacked a Halo Trust camp in northern Afghanistan, killing 10 and injuring 16. This attack on a humanitarian group working to rid the country of landmines shows the barbarity of ISIS Khorasan and its efforts to undermine the Afghan people's security. Given the ongoing events in Afghanistan, we're monitoring this situation very carefully. And as President Biden has stressed, we will hold the Taliban accountable for its commitments not to allow any terrorists to threaten the United States or its allies from Afghan soil. And as I said earlier this week, we must all work together to ensure Afghanistan cannot ever again be a base for terrorism. And while these threats are real, there is good news. The Secretary General's report notes that ISIS financial reserves are on a downward trajectory. This is in part thanks to the hard and valiant work of the United Nations in cooperation with other multilateral bodies. We must continue those efforts. Undercutting the financing of ISIS and other terrorist organizations is one of the most effective ways to defeat them. So let us sharpen our focus and strengthen our efforts to go after terrorist financiers and financial facilitators, including virtual currencies and new payment methods. To this end, the United States continues to believe in the strength of sanctions and the unique role of 1267 ISIS and al-Qaeda sanctions regime. It is the most effective global tool to prescribe specific ISIS branches members and support entities. And it has since its creation in 1999, the 1267 sanctions regime must continue to evolve to ensure it remains a credible counterterrorism tool. But that evolution can never come at the expense of dulling its ability to apply effective pressure on ISIS and al-Qaeda. As we apply this financial pressure, we must remember that the most successful counterterrorism approaches incorporates perspectives and voices beyond those in the national and local governments. We need to listen to people affected by terrorism on the ground. That includes women, youth, civil society, religious leaders, educators, the private sector, victims of terrorism, and affected communities. And some of the people and organizations closest to the threat, they understand it better than anyone. To bolster this kind of civil society engagement, the United States provides funding to the Strong Cities Networks, the Global Community and Engagement Resilience Funds, Mother Schools, and many other civil society organizations that work to strengthen community resilience to violent extremism. Finally, let's address the difficult issue of the approximately 2,000 foreign terrorist fighters in detention centers. About 60,000 of their associated family members, mostly women and children, are stranded in displaced persons camps. This includes tens of thousands of innocent children, and no child should suffer for their parents' crimes. This situation is untenable. It is a humanitarian crisis, human rights crisis, and a security crisis. The United States believes that the repatriation and prosecution as appropriate of those foreign terrorist fighters is the best way to hold individuals accountable for their crimes and prevent their uncontrolled return to countries of origin or elsewhere. To be clear, we do not exclude ourselves in this call. We are repatriating our own as well. The Secretary General's report provides a stark outline of the shifting ISIS threat, but it offers hope and a way forward too. Together, we can stop the spread of ISIS in Africa, counter their presence elsewhere, and undercut their finances. We can listen closely to civil society. We can address the humanitarian crisis caused by foreign terrorist fighters. And together, we can work towards stamping out the ISIS threat once and for all. Thank you.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Thomas Greenfield, for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Tunisia.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, President. First of all, I would like to thank Mr. Vladimir Voronkov, Under-Secretary General and Head of the UNOCT, as well as Ms. Michelle Koningst, Executive Director of CTED, and Mr. Davoud Moradian, Director General of the Afghan Institute for Strategic Studies, for their comprehensive briefings. The Secretary-General's report, which is before us, is the 13th since the adoption of Resolution 2252. However, Daesh, Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations continue to pose a serious threat to peace and security around the world. Countries in situation of conflict or instability are the most exposed to the terrorist threat that is growing. In this context, Tunisia would like to express its great concern as regards the growing terrorist threat in the Sahel region, as well as West Africa, East Africa and Central Africa, where groups affiliated to Daesh and Al-Qaeda continue to control territories, more specifically ports and border regions. These groups mobilize financial resources, weapons and other equipment, particularly drones too. According to the Secretary-General's report, the growth of this threat is largely due to the decentralization of Daesh's power. The heart of this terrorist organization is indeed fragile today, and this is why they are being supported by regional branches so that they can reorganize, reform following their military defeat in Iraq and Syria, without abandoning their main objective, which is to regain their power on the ground centrally. The financing of terrorism continues to pose a great threat. And we also can see that the situation in Afghanistan is worrying. Numerous terrorists have been freed from Afghan prisons. President, in addition to the financial resources that Daesh and Al-Qaeda receive, the Secretary-General's report informs us that modern technologies and more sophisticated technologies are being used to fund terrorist activities, particularly cyber currencies and virtual banks. In addition to revenue from organized crime, particularly from reselling antiquities and trafficking in drugs and precious metals. In addition, Tunisia calls on the international community thus to continue to attach priority to the financing of terrorism, particularly through the exchange of experience and closely following the use of cyber and cryptocurrencies. President, while terrorist groups affiliated to Daesh and Al-Qaeda have so far managed to not been able to establish strategies to instrumentalize the pandemic and use it as a weapon, we must nevertheless continue to be vigilant as regards the repercussions of COVID-19 in the short, mid and long term, and particularly keeping an eye on the threat and tackling them. We're particularly thinking of the possibility for some terrorist groups of carrying out attacks with a gradual lifting of healthcare restrictions, as well as the polarization and the recruitment online recruitment, particularly through social media. Numerous terrorist groups are today transnational, and they fund their doctrine on xenophobia and intolerance. The pandemic is being exploited to spread propaganda, extremist propaganda. This is why Tunisia calls on the international community to step up their efforts following the pandemic so that we can have a recovery on the political, social and economic levels that allows us to tackle the factors that lead to terrorism. President, the first line of defense against terrorism is tackling its root causes and the factors that fuel it. This is why we must coordinate our efforts on an international level so that we can resolve conflicts, these conflicts which are a breeding ground for terrorism, as well as limiting the movement of foreign terrorist fighters and mercenaries towards conflict zones. This prolongs these conflicts and makes them more difficult to resolve. We must also step up our efforts so that we can achieve sustainable development and to fight against all the factors that create vulnerability. This is through the strengthening of good governance, the rule of law, human rights, and through tackling the root causes of violence. President, in conclusion, Tunisia attaches with prioritising the fight against terrorism. We would insist on our commitment on the national and international level to strengthening the framework of international law and international human rights law and IHL. We welcome the adoption of the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy by consensus. Here, we hope that this consensus will be maintained within the Security Council. This is very important for the extension of the mandate of the sanctions regime against Daesh and Al-Qaeda. We are committed to work closely with the different member states and UN entities so that we can build up our multilateral cooperation and achieve our common goals, which is eradicating terrorism. Thank you, President.
Thank you. I thank the representative of Tunisia for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And let me start by thanking the briefers for their comprehensive presentations, as well as the Secretary General for his thorough biannual report. The report is a harsh reminder of the fact that ISIL and other terrorist groups still pose a serious threat to international peace and security. Norway shares the Secretary General's concerns regarding the expansion of ISIL affiliates into Africa. We have witnessed numerous attacks in the Sahel, the Lake Chad region, in East and Central Africa, as well as in Mozambique. We, therefore, express our full support to the global coalition against ISIL and will, together with our international coalition partners, maintain our highly prioritized contributions. The fight against ISIL and other terrorist groups must continue on all levels. Experience shows that ISIL and other terrorist groups exploit existing conflicts and vulnerabilities in states and populations, including gender inequalities and sexual and gender-based violence. We must apply a gender perspective in our response to address the impact of these threats. President, we would like to emphasize 3 principles from our national counterterrorism strategy, which takes a whole-of-society approach to terrorism. We believe these principles are globally applicable. First, prevention. It is clear that preventing violent extremism is the most effective counterterrorism strategy. For every terror attack prevented, we will save human lives and avoid suffering. We also avoid the economic cost of an attack, as well as the larger societal impacts that result from a fear of terrorism. Prevention encompasses a wide range of measures, including education, the provision of basic services, and proactive and cross-cutting outreach from government institutions, civil society, and the private sector. Second, protection. It is critical to impede terrorist attacks through the development of proper infrastructure, such as physical barriers and other obstructions. In this regard, I would like to emphasize the importance of implementing existing Security Council resolutions. Third, aversion. We must disrupt terrorist plots through effective investigation and surveillance by police and security institutions, as well as information from the public. National authorities should make use of effective international tools, such as Interpol databases and border protection programs. These tools must be kept updated and supported by relevant actors, while applied proportionally and in compliance with international law and human rights. President, here in the Security Council, it is particularly important that we identify and prioritize areas of cooperation. We believe financing of terrorism is one of these areas. The increased use of encryption technology and cryptocurrency linked to organized crime underscores the importance of coordination. Because financial instruments see no borders, we too must work across them, like we do in fora such as the Financial Action Task Force. We must continue our dialogue to ensure effective counterterrorism frameworks while protecting humanitarian space. Principled humanitarian action with a focus on avoiding negative unintended consequences of sanctions and promoting humanitarian exemptions and efficient exemptions procedures must be facilitated. Moreover, the pandemic is an underlying factor contributing to increased recruitment to violent extremism and terror organizations, which is well described in the CTED trend reports. Preventing violent extremists' misuse of cyberspace and internet platforms must be a high priority. President, a few months ago, we heard the former Special Advisor of UNITAD, Karim Khan, brief this Council on the investigation of ISIL's atrocities in Iraq. Let us keep in mind as a reminder of what is at stake in our international fight against terror, especially as current events unfold in Afghanistan, where we are deeply concerned by the expansion of ISIL-K in several provinces, as well as the continued presence of Al-Qaeda. We reaffirm the responsibility of all parties to ensure the country does not become a safe haven for terrorists. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize the importance of accountability and the continued need for action against terrorism. The adoption of this year's review of the Global Counterterrorism Strategy by consensus is a strong message that we all must stand together against hate speech, violent extremism, and terrorism. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Norway for his statement. I give the floor now to the representative of Mexico.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mexico would like to thank India for convening this open debate, as well as the keynote speakers for the very valuable information that they have shared with us. In the face of the situation in Afghanistan, my country would like to stress the importance of uniting our efforts to condemn any action that threatens international peace and security, as well as international humanitarian law and international law of human rights. In line with the press statement that we adopted last Monday, Mexico would like to reiterate that we must ensure that the territory of Afghanistan does not become a refuge for the training of terrorists, nor for planning or carrying out terrorist actions as set out in Resolution 1267 of this Council. Mr. President, Mexico has studied very attentively the 13th biennial report of the Secretary General on the threats represented by ISIL, and that today brings us together for this debate. And on this report, I'd like to just highlight a number of points. First of all, Mexico would like to express our consternation about what the report mentions as the most significant development over this period, and that is the expansion of Daesh activity in Africa, where the largest number of victims has been recorded. It's necessary to focus our attention on the cross-border activities of terrorist groups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, and other countries in Central Africa, as mentioned in the Secretary General's report. With regard to the challenges represented by the COVID-19 pandemic, we're worried that the restrictions have made it more difficult to deliver humanitarian assistance in many regions of the world, which has affected the most needy communities. This has created a situation where terrorist organizations have sought to become suppliers of food, charity, monetary resources, and other forms of support, while they have sought to take advantage of the disinformation surrounding the pandemic to promote their violent narratives and consolidate and expand their operations and recruitment. Furthermore, we are concerned about access to sources of funding by ISIL, as was already mentioned this morning, as well as their access to firearms. The increase in the use of cryptocurrencies must be tackled urgently with the support of the private sector. Also, we must strengthen cooperation between the United Nations Office on Counterterrorism and the Counterterrorism Executive Directorate to tackle the links between terrorism and the illicit traffic of weapons, as mentioned in the report. For this, we must work even more on the full implementation of the United Nations Program of Action to prevent, combat, and eradicate the illicit traffic of small arms and light weapons, as well as the regime established by the Arms Trade Treaty. We would like to take this opportunity to make an appeal to those states that have not yet done so to join this important legal instrument. Now, furthermore, we agree with the Secretary General that to tackle the impact of ISIL on women and girls, we need a truly cross-cutting gender agenda. And bearing this in mind, we'd like to recall last month's ARIA formula meeting on the topic of prevention of terrorism and violent extremism by focusing on gender stereotypes, masculinities, and gender inequalities. As a result of that discussion, it was clear that there is a consensus on the need to incorporate the notion of masculinities in evaluating the root causes of terrorism and violent extremism and in prevention strategies. We would like to ask the Secretary General to incorporate this dimension in his next report in order to strengthen a comprehensive gender agenda in analyzing ISIL threats and the threats of other terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda. To conclude, Mr. President, and in light of the fact that in September we will be commemorating the 20th anniversary of the adoption of Resolution 1373, Mexico would like to reiterate the need to carry out an in-depth assessment of the lessons learned and the good practices that the international community has carried out to confront the structural and underlying causes of terrorism. 20 years later, reality has demonstrated to us, including the most recent events, that the so-called war on terror, which was fundamentally dependent on military action, is not the way to tackle the root causes of terrorism and violent extremism. And therefore, now is the time to invest our resources and efforts in prevention and in sustainable development. Lastly, I would like to take this opportunity to reiterate our commitment, the commitment of Mexico to those multilateral initiatives that seek to take up this challenge to peace, international peace and security in a comprehensive, holistic way, including respect for human rights and international humanitarian law, as well as maintaining a gender perspective. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Mexico for her statement. I give the floor now to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, President. We are grateful to Mr. Voronkov and Ms. Konings for their detailed analyses of the situation of the fight against ISIL. We'd also like to express our support for the work of the structures that they head up. We'd also like to thank Mr. Moriarden, our long-time friend, for his comprehensive and emotional but sobering and extremely pertinent briefing. Today, the attention of the international community is glued to the situation in Afghanistan. Of course, when discussing counter-terrorism, we can't sidestep the situation in that country. It would appear that following the tragic events of 9/11, for 20 years, Afghanistan was full of American and NATO forces, trainers and advisors. The official aim of their presence there was to fight terrorism and train Afghan national security forces to this end too. For this, colossal human and financial resources were deployed. What became of this assistance and presence? No sooner did foreign assistance support leave, 20 years of efforts were wiped out. All of this for nothing. No one wanted to, or even indeed no one seemed able to fight for the values and interests inculcated of foreign powers. Has Afghanistan ceased to be a source of terrorist and narcotic threats? Of course not. But dealing with this will now be the job of the new Afghan authorities and the neighbours of Afghanistan. Following the withdrawal of Western contingents, Afghan citizens have been facing an ever greater pile of problems. I'd like to underscore that the Russian Federation will cooperate only with those political forces in Afghanistan who have no ties to terrorists, ISIL, Al-Qaeda and affiliated groups. We trust that all Afghan parties will refrain from violence and will assist in resolving the situation peacefully. President, thanks to consistent efforts of Russian and Syrian forces in recent years, we've managed to substantially weaken the terrorist organizations operating in Syria, particularly ISIL. At the same time, some terrorist cells continue their activities and still pose a serious threat. The most numerous remains the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, formed on the basis of Jabhat al-Nusra. But according to various assessments, there are between 10 and 15,000 of them. The fight against this terrorist organisation is being made more difficult by attempts to present them as some kind of political opposition. One other terrorist organisation that continues to pose a threat is Huras ad-Din, a branch of Al-Qaeda in Syria. According to various sources, there are between 3,500 and 5,000 of them. Half of them are foreign terrorist fighters. On our side, we continue to provide the necessary assistance to the Syrian authorities to counter terrorism. Of concern also is what's happening in other regions of the world. ISIL is spreading their influence in Africa. Their regional branches are strengthening their autonomy too, particularly in Western Africa and the Sahel, as well as Eastern and Central Africa. President, I'd like to once again set forth the Russian position on the issue of return of foreign terrorist fighters. We support the irreversible punishment of them for terrorist crimes and of pooling efforts of the whole international community to this end. In line with international obligations, foreign terrorist fighters affiliated with terrorist activities should be repatriated to their country of origin, where they should be held accountable to a level commensurate to the gravity of their crimes. Or these people should be tried in the place where the crime was committed, in line with national law of the relevant state. It is this cooperation with the legitimate authorities of the countries where the fighters are located that is the key to addressing the manifold problems linked to foreign terrorist fighters and their members of their families. And recently, we've seen active spread of terrorist ideology of ISIL amongst children in cyberspace. We call on member states to carry out relevant work on prevention and de-radicalisation amongst this extremely vulnerable category of population. President, we can't ignore the human rights aspects of the fight against terrorism either. Speaking out in support of human rights and gender aspects is insufficient. The international community needs to see results. Once again, we must raise the question of the operation of the Guantanamo prison. On many occasions, we've heard high-ranking American officials say that they intend to close this facility, notorious for detaining people without trial or investigation, as well as for the torture, inhumane and degrading treatment of prisoners. We also expect from our Western colleagues to consistently fulfil their international legal obligations, which guarantee, inter alia, by the Refugee Convention, the Convention Against Torture, and other fundamental international treaties. These obligations are particularly relevant in a context of the growing mass exodus of people from conflict zones. The fight against terrorism is our common job. We'd call for cooperation on this. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I give the floor now to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President, for convening this important debate. 2 years on from its territorial defeat, Daesh remains a significant global threat. The recent attacks in Baghdad and the continuing violence in Syria provide further tragic evidence of that fact. So we welcome the Secretary-General's report on the threat posed by Daesh. I would like to thank Undersecretary General Voronkov, Executive Director Konix, and Dr. Moradian, in particular for his moving presentation, but for their briefings. We are also indebted to the UN monitoring team, UNOCT, and CTED for their important work in analysing this threat. The UK's position in countering Daesh is very clear. We remain an active and committed member of the counter-Daesh coalition, the global coalition against Daesh. We are a co-leader of the coalition's counter-propaganda effort, and we host the counter-Daesh communications cell in the UK. We continue to provide significant humanitarian and stabilisation support to those liberated areas of Iraq and Syria. We also continue to facilitate the return of unaccompanied or orphan children on a case-by-case basis and subject to national security concerns. However, we remain clear that those who have fought or supported Daesh should face justice for their crimes in the most appropriate jurisdiction. Often that will be the region where those crimes were committed. While it is vital that we focus on the immediate threats Daesh pose, we must also work together to tackle the long-term drivers of terrorism. That's why the UK recently announced an additional £2.6 million of funding to support stabilisation in northeast Syria. We must also remain alive to the rising threat in other geographies. What is happening now in Afghanistan is a tragedy. We will remain vigilant to the return of the terrorist threat. We all share an interest in making sure Afghanistan does not again become a safe haven for terrorists. The threat continues to grow in sub-Saharan Africa. We are providing security, stabilisation and humanitarian assistance in many countries to help them tackle the threat, build stability and support affected communities. Meanwhile, Daesh continues its attempts to incite and recruit supporters around the world, particularly using social media and encrypted online platforms. Terrorism is global and it requires a global response. Multilateral cooperation lies at the heart of that global response, and at the UN level, we welcome the continued efforts of UNOCT, CTED and other UN agencies in supporting states to tackle it. At the same time, we must be agile in recognising the other new and emerging threats, including the use and misuse of new technologies. We should continue efforts to counter terrorist financing and extreme right-wing terrorism, and to prevent terrorist misuse of the internet. And finally, Mr. President, we believe it's important to bring our values to this effort. When countering terrorism, we must all ensure that we protect and promote human rights, fundamental freedoms, and the rule of law. We must integrate a gender-sensitive and whole-of-society approach into these efforts. In this way, we will uphold the very principles on which the UN was founded. Mr. President, the UK will remain steadfast in the global fight against terrorism and violent extremism. We will continue to stand up for our shared values and interests, and we will continue to work with our partners and through the multilateral system to this end. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for his statement. I give the floor now to the representative of China.
Mr. President, I welcome the presence of His Excellency Zhizhenka, Minister of External Affairs, and thank him for presiding over today's meeting. I thank USG Voronkov and Executive Director Konix for their briefings. I also listened carefully to the statement by Mr. Moradian, the civil society representative for Afghanistan. In a few days, there will be the 20th anniversary of September 11. Although important progress has been made in international counterterrorism cooperation, the current world situation on this front remains complex and severe, with terrorism and violent extremism intertwined. As the SG's report pointed out, in the first half of this year, the Islamic State has regrouped in places including Iraq and Syria and has further infiltrated the African region. It has been providing financial support to terrorist organizations in various regions, and terrorist attacks have occurred from time to time. COVID-19 has posed economic and social challenges which may bring a new wave of terrorism. The international community needs to attach great importance to this matter and adopt comprehensive measures to jointly respond to the threat of terrorism. Mr. President, terrorism is a common enemy of our societies, and combating terrorism is a common responsibility of the international community. Countries should strengthen their cooperation at the national, regional, and global levels by stepping up counter-terrorism efforts in areas such as early warning, counter-terrorism financing, travel restrictions, border supervision, and intelligence exchanges. In the first half of this year, terrorist organizations designated by the Security Council has caused the maximum number of deaths in Africa. China supports further coordination between the Security Council's Counterterrorism Committee (CTC), CTAD, and UNOCT so as to help African countries strengthen their counterterrorism capacity building. In the fight against terrorism, there should not be any double standards. There's no such thing as a good terrorist or a bad terrorist. Terrorism, no matter when and where it occurs, for whatever motive and carried out by whomever, should be resolutely opposed to and stopped. Determining a terrorist based on political self-interest is essentially condoning terrorist activities and seriously undermining the international counterterrorism cooperation. The fight against terrorism cannot be delineated by ideology. We firmly oppose linking terrorism to specific countries, governments, ethnic groups, or religions. We are also against allowing terrorist organizations to breed, develop, and carry out violent attacks under the pretext of protecting ethnic minorities and religious freedom. Mr. President, in combating terrorism, emphasis should be placed on prevention and elimination of its root causes. Counterterrorism measures should focus on long-term solutions by addressing both the symptoms and root causes. It is important to adopt comprehensive political, economic, judicial, and social means and keep to peaceful solution of hotspot issues through political means. It is important to assist the member states in eradicating poverty, strengthening capacity building, promoting sustainable economic and social development, and advocating mutual respect and harmonious coexistence among different civilizations, religions, and ethnic groups. Young people are susceptible to extreme ideologies. Therefore, special attention should be paid to strengthening youth education and employment so as to provide a favorable environment for their growth. Countries should carry out exchanges and cooperation on preventing counterterrorism and de-radicalization measures such as vocational training, education, and community correctional measures to help vulnerable countries strengthen their counterterrorism capacity building. In combating terrorism, it's important to focus on key issues while taking into consideration new developments. We must be highly vigilant against terrorist forces using COVID-19 to instigate terrorist activities and strive to solve outstanding problems such as abuse of internet and emerging technologies by terrorists, diversification of terrorist financing channels, and confluence of organized crimes. A large number of foreign terrorist fighters have been strengthened in Syria, Iraq, and other countries for a long time, which is increasingly becoming a huge security hazard. Solutions should be developed as soon as possible, and repatriation be properly facilitated. In his statement just now, Mr. Moradian focused on the counterterrorism situation in Afghanistan. For the 20 years since the war on terrorism in the country started, the threat of terrorism has not been eliminated. Instead, the number of terrorist organizations in Afghanistan has increased from single digit to more than 20, with close to 10,000 foreign terrorists. The Security Council's 1267 and 1988 committee monitoring teams have issued reports repeatedly this year, pointing out that terrorist organizations such as Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, the East Islamic Movement, and the Pakistani Taliban have multiplied and gathered in Afghanistan. The current situation in Afghanistan has undergone major changes, and terrorist organizations are likely to take advantage of this chaos. Afghanistan must never become a terrorist paradise again. We hope the Taliban will completely cut off ties with all terrorist organizations, and all countries should cooperate with each other in combating all terrorism in accordance with international law and Security Council resolutions so as to bring hopes of peace to Afghanistan. China will continue to actively work with the United Nations, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and Global Counterterrorism Forum to strengthen exchanges and cooperation in areas such as counterterrorism, intelligence exchanges, combating terrorism financing, transnational organized crimes, and cyber terrorism in a joint effort to respond to terrorist threats and maintaining world peace and stability. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement. I give the floor now to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you very much, Minister, and I want to thank the Indian Presidency also for ensuring a continued focus on the critical issue of counterterrorism, and I'd like to thank our briefers this morning also for their excellent presentations. Mr. President, it may sound like a truism, but in fact it's a fact. The scourge of terrorism remains one of the gravest threats to international peace and security, despite significant progress made by this Council and its Counter-Terrorism Committee. The Secretary-General's report is clear. In the first half of this year, the threat posed by ISIL continued to grow, with ISIL activities expanding in Africa, notwithstanding the restrictions imposed by COVID-19. The report also highlights the significant threat posed by ISIL Khorasan to the people of Afghanistan, evidenced most recently by the horrific attack on the Halo Trust staff in Baghlan province on the 8th of June. This Council spoke with one united voice to condemn that heinous attack. While the circumstances in Afghanistan have changed very significantly since then, we cannot forget that aspect of the conflict environment. Mr. President, the pandemic has accelerated the digital transition across so many aspects of our societies. Unfortunately, this is also true for terrorists and for terrorism. Ireland supports the Secretary-General's call for Member States to rise to the challenge of digitally enabled terrorism through international cooperation and through effective government in line with international law. Civil society and the private sector play a crucial role. The challenge, however, as always, is moving from rhetoric to implementation. We were particularly interested to learn of the important work carried out by UNDP, Burkina Faso, Kenya, and other partners to address the differential impact of the threat of ISIL and its affiliates on women and girls. Specifically, we welcome the development of a toolkit to generate gender disaggregated data and to inform a gender-sensitive response to those threats. Greater detail in future reports on the outcome of this work would be useful, including on how it could be applied more broadly. Put simply, including gender-sensitive data, disaggregated data, in our analysis will strengthen our capacity to address terrorism. Mr. President, Ireland is a small, open economy with a thriving financial services industry. We know that both terrorism and organised crime are fuelled by complex systems of money laundering and terrorist financing. We also recognise that countering such financing is a central part of our global counter-terrorism response. At the domestic level, we have robust institutional counter-terrorist financing framework. This is kept under review to reflect new and emerging trends, as well as EU requirements and FATF recommendations. We've also recently introduced legislation which extends counter-terrorist financing obligations to virtual asset providers. Mr. President, just last week at the EAM meeting organised by Kenya, members of this Council heard of the negative impact of some regulations in countering the financing of terrorism and the resultant de-risking practices on humanitarian actors and provision of humanitarian aid. The Secretary-General has also raised concerns that tightening counter-terrorism measures by some Member States during the pandemic could negatively impact non-profit organisations and emergency humanitarian aid. We reiterate once more that such measures must not impede the delivery of principled humanitarian assistance, nor infringe on the legitimate activities of humanitarian and civil society organisations carrying out vital work, often in fragile or conflict-affected contexts. We will remain vigilant on that issue right across our agenda here in the Security Council. This Council has a responsibility to ensure that measures to counter terrorist funding are applied based on risk and that they fully comply with international law, including international humanitarian law, international humanitarian rights law, human rights law, and international refugee law. Mr. President, independent oversight of counter-terrorism legislation has been effective in mitigating some of these risks and challenges. Domestically, Ireland is undertaking an independent review of its main body of counter-terrorism legislation and has recently published proposals for an independent examiner of security legislation. Such an entity will ensure that legislation is necessary, is fit for purpose, and contains appropriate human rights safeguards. Finally, Mr. President, we know that victims and survivors of terrorism continue to struggle to have their voices heard. We consider that they need support, and that support should be reflected here and their rights be upheld. We firmly believe that a holistic approach to transitional justice is essential to upholding those rights. We will work to that end in our role here at the table of the Security Council. Tomorrow, we will mark the 4th International Day of Remembrance and Tribute to Victims of Terrorism. So let all of us around this table recommit to supporting their gender-specific needs, to upholding their rights, and most importantly, to hearing and heeding their voices. This is surely the least we owe to the countless victims and survivors of terrorism. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Ireland for her statement. I give the floor now to the representative of Niger.
I thank you, Mr. President, for organizing this debate. I would like to thank Mr. Voronkov, Madam Konix, and Mr. Morajan for the wealth of information and clarity of their presentations. When we discussed the 12th report of the Secretary General, my delegation expressed its satisfaction with positive developments in 2020 as part of the global anti-terrorist fight, which led to the neutralization of several senior commanders of terrorist organizations in Iraq, Syria, but also in Africa. Today, unfortunately, the situation is quite alarming. My country is concerned by the resilience and the capacity for adaptation that the terrorist organization Daesh has demonstrated. While losing all its territorial control in Iraq and Syria, it has managed to export its atrocities to several regions of the world, including Africa. Indeed, the continent of Africa has become the epicenter of global terrorist activities, as clearly indicated in the 13th report. Statistics show that since the end of 2019, over 2/3 of terrorist attacks committed by Daesh fighters in the world have taken place on the African continent, mostly in the regions of Sahel and the Lake Chad Basin. This rapid expansion of the Daesh threat in Africa has been made possible through several local groups affiliated with the terrorist organizations. My country, Niger, has been confronting the terrorist threats for several years now on at least 3 of its borders in the west, south, and north. And since the start of this year, we have experienced an increase in atrocities committed by terrorist organizations affiliated with Daesh and to a lesser extent with Al-Qaeda. A dozen armed attacks in the first 6 months of the year caused some 500 deaths, mostly civilians. Most of these attacks were perpetrated in the west of the country, in the so-called 3 borders region where Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso meet. The most recent attack targeted the village of Dari Dai near the Malian border, causing the death of 37 people. Just yesterday, 47 civilians and soldiers were killed in Burkina Faso in a terrorist attack. The perpetrators of these gratuitous attacks against defenseless populations must be held accountable for their crimes. Mr. President, this increase in terrorist attacks in African countries is taking place at a time when almost all the attention of the international community has been focused on the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, one calamity should not obscure another. The efforts that we are making to eradicate the spread of the coronavirus must not make us forget the threat of international terrorism. This is especially true as the multiple challenges that the governments and populations of African regions affected by COVID have always confronted make them even more vulnerable. These challenges are poverty, famine, precarity, ignorance, youth unemployment, porous borders, and intercommunal conflicts. All these challenges have facilitated the rapid expansion of the terrorist threat that I mentioned earlier. The weakness of defense structures in these countries, as well as political instability, are aggravating factors. In the face of such a calamitous situation, the international community has a duty to take urgent measures to help us before it's too late, to help the governments of the African countries affected. Because I must stress, Daesh has never hidden its ambition to restore its capacity to plan and promote attacks around the world, including through the use of its regional affiliates who have become quite powerful. Mr. President, my delegation considers that the combat against terrorism cannot be won only through military means. It has to also be won by implementing programs of development and measures aimed at eradicating the underlying practices that facilitate the spread of terrorism. I'm thinking in particular of corruption, of the illicit commerce of natural resources, and money laundering, just to mention a few of these practices. States must, for this purpose, work to apply the recommendations of Resolution 2462, as well as all the relevant resolutions of the Security Council that aim to combat and prevent violent extremism and the emergence and online dissemination of terrorist ideas and narratives. It is bearing this in mind that I would like to hail the remarkable efforts of the relevant entities of the United Nations, and in particular the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism, the Counterterrorism Executive Directorate of the Counterterrorism Committee, and the United Nations Office to Combat Drugs and Crime. These bodies, in spite of the restrictions of the COVID-19 pandemic, have found necessary alternative means to ensure the continuity in strengthening the capacity of member states by using innovative procedures such as remote evaluation, online training, organization of virtual events. To conclude, I would like to reaffirm the conviction of my country that the fight against terrorism requires the engagement of all. For it to be effective, our approach must be holistic, taking into account the social, economic, and political roots of radicalization. Military actions must necessarily be accompanied by the softer activity of development and good governance. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Niger for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Estonia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'd like to start with thanking Undersecretary Voronkov and Executive Director Konings for their comprehensive briefings, introducing the fresh findings on threats posed by ISIL and its affiliates. As one of the penholders of Afghanistan, we also highly appreciate the insights provided by Mr. Dawood Moradian. Mr. President, Secretary General's report notes that the pandemic has had a substantive impact on the threat of terrorism. The measures taken to tackle the spread of virus have complicated terrorist planning and operations. Transportation, recruitment, fundraising has become more difficult in many parts of the globe. However, we must remain vigilant. UN reporting emphasizes that the threat has persisted and increased in conflict zones such as Afghanistan and the Sahel. We remain concerned about those and other areas where ISIL and Al-Qaeda continue to undermine regional security. The deteriorating situation in Afghanistan remains of substantial concern. The number of civilians killed and injured has reached the highest on record. Half the population in Afghanistan is in need of humanitarian aid. Estonia calls for those in power to adhere to international law, respect human rights, and ensure that terrorism finds no support or shelter there. Estonia further recognizes the threat posed by Islamic State in Greater Sahara. the organization continues to mount attacks on international security forces as well as local communities in the tri-border area of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. In these areas, terrorism is closely interlinked with other forms of communal violence. Therefore, in order to address extremism and terrorism, more attention must be given to lowering intercommunal tensions and nurturing political reconciliation. Mr. President, we are facing new complex security challenges like cyber and hybrid threats, and also capabilities like drones that increase the real-time threat from terrorists to civilian populations and our men and women on operations and peacekeeping missions across the world. In light of the constantly evolving nature of the threat, we appreciate the role played by Eurojust and Europol in combating all forms of terrorism in the European Union and beyond, and welcome the increased cooperation of these agencies with the United Nations. Coordinated efforts must be taken to tackle the challenges posed by foreign terrorist fighters. Estonia commends the UNOCT on the coordination of humanitarian law. Ignoring these principles can undermine counterterrorism activities and lead to increased radicalization fed by violence and a sense of impunity. We condemn all attempts of misusing the counterterrorism agenda as a pretext for human rights violations, for silencing political opponents and members of religious and ethnic minorities. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Estonia for his statement. I give the floor now to the representative of France.
Thank you, President. I would also like to start by thanking Mr. Voronkov, Ms. Konanks, and Mr. Moradian for their briefings and their extremely comprehensive views. President, the fight against terrorism remains a priority, more so than ever. The most recent developments in Afghanistan, which could lead to a resurgence of the terrorist threat, is a stark reminder of this. France is doing its part in the fight against terrorism, particularly as part of the International Coalition Against Daesh, which met on the 28th of June in Rome. This coalition met on the 28th of June in Rome. This coalition is the bedrock of the international fight against Daesh. Our collective action has also been strengthened thanks to the adoption, by consensus, by the General Assembly of the 7th UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy, and this was in June. While Daesh no longer controls any territory and that people under its yoke have been liberated in Iraq and Syria, we know that the threat remains serious in a context where terrorism continues to spread. In Afghanistan, the victory of the Taliban, and we know, have not cut their ties with some terrorist groups, and this could worsen the threat locally, but also across the whole sub-region. The spread of Daesh in Central Africa and Southern Africa also remains a major source of concern. President, the first pillar of our collective action against terrorism must be to come on the occasion of the high-level week on counter-terrorism. France and India organised on the 25th of June with 172 participants and as well as UN specialised bodies. We had an event on the fight against financing of terrorism. This meeting set out the risks associated with virtual assets and new instruments of funding, particularly underscoring the need for current obligations in terms of the fight against money laundering and financing of terrorism applies in the same way to all institutions, whether they be virtual or not. These obligations primarily stem from Resolution 2462 of the Security Council, which France brought forward on 2019, but also recommendations from the FATF. We continue to be committed in this fight through encouraging particularly the holding of a third conference on no money for terror as soon as the health situation pillar of our common efforts must be to tackle the root causes of terrorism. Terrorist groups feed off frustration and despair and conflict. We must, on the one hand, deal with the root causes of conflicts, of extremism and terrorism. In Syria, for example, this requires a political solution in line with the provisions of Resolution 2254, and in Iraq, this requires stabilization and reconstruction. We must also tirelessly tackle the ideological indoctrination, particularly tackling the use of the internet for terrorist ends to spread Daesh propaganda. France continues to constantly and determinedly strengthen its national response to, as well as European and international response to counter this propaganda. And this is done in line with the private sector and particularly with internet companies. I welcome the fact that the Christchurch appeal, which we launched with New Zealand, has brought 55 states on board so far, in addition to the European Commission and 2 international organisations and 10 businesses. Finally, and this is our third point, the fight against terrorism must be done while respecting our principles. First and foremost, this includes framing it within human rights, international law and international humanitarian law. A collective action must ensure that the work to counter terrorism functions while we can allow at the same time vital humanitarian work to take place. This fight must also allow justice to be served for all victims of such barbarity. On the 31st of March 2021, 18 ministers of foreign affairs, including that of France, pledged that they would not remain silent when faced with the crimes committed in Syria, including those committed by Daesh. These crimes could be tantamount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. Rest assured that everything will be done so that they do not remain unpunished. These crimes have an unbearable impact primarily on children. Unlike their parents, children have not chosen to join terrorist groups in a war zone where we have no control. In terms of the greater interest of in children, orphans and non-accompanied minors, which are the most vulnerable, they must be repatriated as soon as conditions allow. France has done this on several occasions. For adult foreign terrorist fighters who have joined the ranks of Daesh must be tried the closest place to where they committed their crimes. This is a question of security and justice, but also a moral obligation as regards their victims. In conclusion, rest assured that France will continue in a firm and determined fashion to do its part in the international fight against terrorism around the world so that we can tackle this scourge. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of France for her statement. I give the floor now to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Subramaniam Jaishankar, Minister of External Affairs of India, for organizing this meeting and traveling to New York to hold it. I also thank Undersecretary Vladimir Voronkov and ASG Michelle Connings for their briefings of the Secretary General's 13th Strategic Report, and thank the Secretary General for producing that report. As all other delegations that have spoken before me have reflected, the threat posed by ISIL and its affiliate remains real and dangerously potent. As the findings of the report have noted, the group still maintains operational capability and could likely surge its activities in a post-COVID-19 landscape. I want to point to Kenya's experience as a way to illustrate perhaps some of the responses in different countries and theaters that could be utilized and learned from by this council. We are a frontline state against international terrorism, and since the Al-Qaeda attack in 1998 on the US Embassy that treated Kenyans as acceptable collateral damage to their evil actions, we have sought to fight this foe. We have joined up our capabilities within government, and today terrorism is faced by a true multi-agency approach that holds from the national level up to the local level, and that is driven by intelligence sharing and local joint action. We have also stood up what we think is a robust but still growing prevention capability that includes disengagement from very early on in the radicalization and recruitment cycle, all the way to the disengagement of hardened fighters who do not fit in our judicial system. We have worked within the prison sector and within the judiciary to ensure that our magistrates and the legal profession are better aware of the laws in the books and the kind of threat that we face. We have worked on building countering violent extremism programs and have now extended them to the security sector in a way that allows us to directly and operationally deliver messages to sites where Al-Shabaab and similar groups have tried to drive their message. We are committed to the public being involved and aware of this challenge, and we're committed to working together with our partners regionally and globally. We have initiated what we call county action plans that bring together civil society, local government administration, different ministries, and security agencies at the county level to diagnose a problem within a certain template and take action together. And we're very grateful to some of the countries here in the Council that have been robust partners in that endeavor. I point to this experience to only say something simple, which is that in the coming years, we are going to need to build the capabilities of counterterrorism within the state and not merely as episodes, temporary episodes for temporary challenges, but rather standing and permanent capabilities. I want to point to a specific issue of concern that was reflected in the report, and that is on the victims of sexual violence by ISIL and the children born of such abuse, many of whom continue to be confined in camps in Iraq and Syria. What is unfortunate is that such confinement centers are becoming not only breeding grounds for recruitment and radicalizing, but also incubators of ardent terrorist elements. Decisive action is necessary to dismantle this vicious cycle, and we highly recommend that the Council, in its engagement with the mandates that are relevant to those camps, to take this into account and action it. We are alarmed by ISIL's expansion in many regions, especially in countries in Africa. Its provinces and offshoots are entrenching themselves in conflict situations with far-reaching implications. We appreciate very much the awareness of this threat in countries in Africa that has been reflected by delegations that have spoken before me, but we would like to add a note of caution, which is to perhaps not associate Africa with ISIL or Africa with terrorism, because the overwhelming majority of African countries do not, in fact, have an ISIL challenge. And doing so not only mischaracterizes the reality, but can wrongly shape our response to the challenge as it exists. One is by creating a two-track counterterrorism, which is this is counterterrorism for ISIL in Africa and counterterrorism elsewhere. And usually twin tracks are usually filled with double standards and perhaps not enough robust support for those countries in Africa. Secondly, it can create a sense of hopelessness by the international community by giving the impression to policymakers that the whole continent is suffering from terrorism. And therefore, if it's such a large problem, well, then maybe nothing can be done about it. So I think we need to be very aware of that as we comment on this challenge. Having said that, as the ongoing developments that have led to the takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban show, the Council should be concerned about the possibility that extremist groups or groups that hold an extremist worldview may be inspired within the African region and internationally with dire long-term consequences. I listened very carefully to Dawood Moradian and really think he has a lot to contribute in terms of his ideas and his directness. We continue to be concerned that terrorism financing activities by groups such as Al-Shabaab have surged, with their revenue collection sometimes rivaling and even surpassing that of the federal government of Somalia and sometimes other governments elsewhere. We do not think we are taking enough action to strangle the terrorist financing of these groups, and we must face up to this and make our actions at the regional and global level much tougher. Mr. President, I would like to recommend to this Council your comments on the predictability and transparency of the listing regime. I think we need to take that very seriously. When countries bring a group that is a terrorist group to the Council, they need to find a pre-established, clear criteria that applies. When Kenya has tried to bring a certain group to this Council, it has been refused, even though we all know that that group is an affiliate of Al-Qaeda and clearly belongs in the 1267 regime. What this has done is that it has weakened the credibility of the 1267 regime because it appears to be a regime that applies different rules to different situations. We very much appreciate the limits of how counterterrorism can affect humanitarian aid, but we would like this Council to better consider that terrorism itself has led and is leading to humanitarian crises. The fact that terrorist groups are looking to destroy states, to control populations, is itself one of the major drivers of humanitarian catastrophe. Therefore, counterterrorism is not in opposition to humanitarian action. Counterterrorism is one of the tools to prevent humanitarian disaster. We highly advocate, rather than continued repeated statements on the principles we all hold, for serious discussion about what carve-outs we should build, how we should implement carve-outs, and how we should actually continue to strengthen the counterterrorism regime. We are open to that discussion. That was the point of our ARIA meeting, and we hope that we have that discussion rather than state to each other the same discussions and arguments that we have while terrorists continue to use humanitarian supply chains to gain resources and to gain recruits. We also want to urge the protection of democratic processes and a united global call denouncing any attempts of takeover of legitimate political aspirations of citizenries by ISIL or Al-Qaeda elements. In particular, we think that the elections in our region, in countries with Al-Qaeda or ISIS groups, should have specific protections to prevent the takeover of state structures by terrorist organizations. To that end, the full effect of Resolution 1267 must be felt, and we want to recommend to this Council to list Al-Shabaab as an affiliate of Al-Qaeda. And we believe that that will reflect this Council's seriousness about terrorism, holding terrorists to account, seriousness about the architecture that this Council established after 9/11. To not do so will, to us, reflect a Security Council that is backing away from its own commitments against terrorism. Mr. President, sorry to speak on too long. I will now conclude. And that is to say that we notice that one of the missing pieces of discussion and deliberation in dealing with this problem is perhaps what the delegation of Mexico was alluding to on the issue of masculinity, is actually how identity and state building are interacting to actually produce terrorist thinking, terrorist worldviews, and radicalization. We believe that we must deal with the issue of how identity is utilized and mediated in the process of state building when we are undertaking peace building, when we are undertaking transitions out of UN peacekeeping missions, and when we are promoting long-term support to countries that have been affected by terrorist groups. Let me finally say that we support the press statement circulated by you, Mr. President, and support the elements and the spirit of that statement. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Kenya for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Vietnam.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Undersecretary General Voronkov, Assistant Secretary General Konings, and Mr. Moradian for the informative briefings. It is deeply concerning that the threats posed by Daesh have continued to increase and that Daesh is trying to regroup and resume its attack capabilities. African region has been debilitated by ongoing armed conflicts, humanitarian crises, natural disasters, and deadly diseases. It is now further threatened by increasing terrorist presence in the region. As we have witnessed, the socio-economic fallouts of the COVID-19 pandemic have intensified in conflict situations. These could exacerbate conditions prone to be exploited by Daesh and its affiliates in the medium and long terms. In that context, I would like to share the following points. First, the international community should remain vigilant at all times and be proactive in our readiness. Solidarity and cooperation are our most effective response. International cooperation and technical assistance is crucial in enhancing regional and national capacities to leave no weakest link to be exploited by terrorists. Operational cooperation, monitoring of terrorist movement, detecting and responding to imminent attacks, and countering terrorist financing and money laundering. We commend the efforts of the UNOCT, CTED, and relevant entities in the Global Counterterrorism Compact in coordinating efforts to tackle the scourge of Daesh. Second, an effective counterterrorism strategy must be in full compliance with the UN Charter and international law, including international humanitarian, human rights, and refugees laws. The humanitarian and security situation posed by thousands of ISIL fighters, including foreign terrorist fighters, and their family members remaining in Iraq and Syria, should be addressed with urgency and in a sustainable manner. We encourage member states and international organizations to enhance sharing of best practices in reintegration and rehabilitation while ensuring best interests of the child wherever children are concerned. Terrorist acts must be prosecuted and punished in accordance with the rule of law. Third, the Security Council must remain firmly committed to using all tools at its disposal to detect and avert new threats of terrorism. Terrorists' use of the internet and new technologies to raise money, recruit, and propagate their agendas deserve our heightened attention. Recent developments in Afghanistan necessitate enhanced vigilance and strengthened cooperation to fight terrorism in the region. In this regard, we recall the press statement issued earlier this week by the Council, in which it stressed the need to ensure Afghanistan territory should not be used to threaten or attack any country, and parties should not support terrorists operating on the territory of any other country. Last but not least, terrorism can be rooted out when dealt with holistically. Comprehensive strategies should focus on addressing its underlying causes, building cohesive societies that are resilient to terrorism and radicalization, promoting sustainable socio-economic development, culture of peace and tolerance, national reconciliation and harmony. A whole of society approach involving all actors, including non-governmental organizations, private sector, technology companies, remains very relevant. Mr. President, Vietnam maintains a firm position of rejecting terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. We will continue to actively engage in advancing the global fight against terrorism on the basis of UN Charter, international law, and our common values. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Vietnam for his statement. I give the floor now to the representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Thank you, Mr. President, and we also thank our briefers for their presentations. The threat of terrorism and violent extremism is among our most complex challenges. Every day, people continue to lose their lives to terrorism, and families and communities continue to suffer. 21st August 2021 marks the 4th commemoration of the International Day of Remembrance of and Tribute to the Victims of Terrorism. On that day, St. Vincent and the Grenadines will join the global community in pausing to remember all of those affected by terrorism. As the day approaches, we are ever mindful that we must directly confront the root causes of terrorism to ensure that the pain of these victims is not in vain. Mr. President, while we condemn all acts of violence and atrocious crimes committed by ISIL and its affiliates, it is important to recognize that the traditional methods of warfare have shifted and the threat of terrorism is growing. Daesh and other terrorist groups have taken advantage of the disruption, grievances, and development setbacks caused by the unprecedented global crisis, both online and on the ground. St. Vincent and the Grenadines notes with concern the findings of the Secretary General's report regarding the African continent, where regional affiliates have been further strengthened, especially in West Africa and the Sahel, as well as East and Central Africa. We are particularly troubled about the spillover from Mali into Burkina Faso and Niger, incursions from Nigeria into Niger, Chad, and Cameroon, and from Mozambique into the United Republic of Tanzania. We also note with concern that ISIL Khorasan has expanded its presence in several provinces of Afghanistan, and Daesh affiliates in Southeast Asia continue to disturb counterterrorism operations with a steady pace of attacks. We cannot allow Afghanistan to become a safe haven for terrorism again. All counterterrorism actions must be conducted in accordance with international law and with the full implementation of the provisions of the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Strategy and relevant General Assembly and Security Council resolutions. We call on member states to redouble efforts and remain committed to the full protection and promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms across all efforts to counter terrorism and prevent violent extremism conducive to terrorism. We must also effectively and efficiently share information responsibly with our regional and international partners. In response to the concerns of terrorism and in an effort to enhance and guarantee a safe and free Caribbean region, St. Vincent and the Grenadines remains committed to the CARICOM counterterrorism strategy, which aims to reduce the risk of terrorism and associated violent extremism by denying terrorists the means and opportunity to carry out their activities and improve the Caribbean community's defense against terrorist attacks. Countering the financing of terrorism remains an essential part of the global fight against terror. Thus, in our efforts to combat emerging terrorist financing risk, we must fully implement Resolution 2462, which requires member states to disrupt and to criminalize the financing of terrorism for any purpose. Moreover, all initiatives to combat terrorist financing must be designed in such a way that they safeguard all legitimate and well-managed financial activities, including in offshore jurisdictions. In conclusion, we reaffirm our commitment to the implementation of the relevant international instruments, Security Council Resolution 1373, and all subsequent resolutions related to combating terrorism. It is also imperative that the Security Council continues to play a leading role in promoting international peace and security. We must remain dedicated to strengthening the global alliance against terrorism. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines for her statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. Before concluding, I would like to thank the Security Council Affairs Directorate, the Director and the team for the support extended to the Indian Presidency. The meeting is adjourned.